For centuries, we've been taught that the transatlantic slave trade was a uniquely European phenomenon, perpetrated by white colonisers against people of colour. But what if I told you that's not entirely true? In this video, we're going to challenge that narrative and explore an often overlooked role of other groups, including blacks, Jews and Arabs, in the slave trade. We'll also be looking at darker chapters in American history, including the Civil War, lynching and involvement of the Jews in the Ku Klux Klan. The transatlantic slave trade is one of the most horrific and well-documented chapters in human history. But despite its widespread recognition, there is a common myth that perpetuates the idea that white Europeans were the sole perpetrators of a heinous crime. But what about the thousands of Africans who were sold their own kin into slavery, or Jewish merchants who profited from the slave, or Arab slavers who raided and enslaved millions across Africa and in Asia today? We're going to explore this overlooked role of these groups and also in the slave trade, as well as some darker chapters of American history. One of the most significant aspects of the slave trade in the role of African kingdoms and societies, many African rulers and elites were involved in the slave trade, selling their own people into slavery or using them as collateral to secure loans or alliances. The Achanti Empire in Ghana, for example, was a major player in the slave trade, with many of its leaders becoming wealthy and powerful through their enslavement in it. Similarly, Jewish merchants played a significant role in the slave trade. Many Jewish traders and brokers operating in West Africa and other parts of the world. In fact, some historians have estimated up to 50% of the slaves transported across the Atlantic were sold by Jewish traders. And as for Arab involvement, it's estimated that millions of people were enslaved by Arab slavers across Africa and Asia, with many being forced to convert to Islam or adopt Arabic customs. As well, if you want to leave a like and subscribe before I get into this video, it will really help this channel out and a lot more to help it grow. If you read a book called The Secret Relationships Between Blacks and Jews, or even a book like Jewish Onslaught by Tony Martin, who was attacked for making this book on Jewish slavery in America, he actually talks about the West Dutch Indian Company and also the parts of Secret Relationships Between Blacks and Jews, Volume 1 and 2. In fact, at the height of the slave trade, only a small percentage of whites actually owned slaves. It was around 3 to 8% during the height of the slave trade. Whites were also enslaved as well, and people kind of always forget about this, especially when it comes down to Turkey. In Istanbul, there was actually white slave trades during the insurgency of when the Ottomans went and took over Constantinople, as known now as Istanbul, the Barbary slave trade. And also, the word slave is actually also a reference to Slavic, since Vikings would also take over certain parts of Europe and also have slaves as well, and including as the Slavic slave trade as well. Christians and Catholics were also owned slaves as well. And research suggests that white slavery was more common between 1580 and 1780. And a lot of people don't actually know this, but a lot of narrative that is constructed around this are racist Jews who actually is a bit of a confusion. For example, if you look at what a white European is, a lot of people were confused that a lot of white Europeans did slavery in America, but it actually turned out that a lot of those white people were actually Jewish, and they were actually Jewish or Ashkenazi Jews, or some type of descendants from them at least. So going back to, what about the slavery in America? Whilst European colonisers did engage in forced labour practices, Native Americans were also enslaved by European colonisers during the Civil War. African Americans were fought on behalf of their enslavers. Many died in battle and were captured and sold back into slavery. And after the war, African Americans were subjugated to a campaign of terror and violence known as lynching. Thousands of people were killed in mobs motivated by racial hatred, but it's well less known that Jews were also involved in lynching, and many Jewish individuals and groups practice in these violent acts, often as a part of their own anti-black racism. Like I mentioned with Jewish Onslaught as well, when Tony Martin did actually talk about this, he actually talked about racist Jews, and he talked about how they also constructed about other parts, for example, like with the Hamitic myth, and also what Hasidic Jews would also do to black children. So what can we learn from this complex and often painful history? Firstly, it's important to recognise that slavery was a global phenomenon that involved many different groups and societies. Secondly, we also need to acknowledge that racism and discrimination were not limited to European colonisers alone. Many African leaders and other groups also engaged in discriminatory practices against marginalised populations. And finally, we need to work towards a more nuanced understanding of history that acknowledges the complexity and multifaceted nature of human experience. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this video about me talking about slavery. Some other parts of it not just being exclusively to parts of it as well, like also be Arabs, Jews and blacks also being involved in slavery. And as well, if you want to click on these videos, if you really like history, you'll enjoy these other videos that I've done about the Holocaust industry by Norman Finkelstein and also David Irving, a historian who's also written many books on literature about history. And as well, if you want to go to the link in the description below where I have my link to my second channel and or at least my link tree where you can see my other channel and also my Discord.